They said they didn't need God. They mocked, they provoked, they shrugged off faith in public, and in each story there is a last chapter that often looks strangely humble, fragile, or painfully lonely. Today we walk through 12 lives, familiar names and a few less certain ones, each introduced by a flash of defiance or scandal, followed by the public fallout, and by what came after. This is not an attempt to declare God's courtroom over any soul. It is a sober pastoral reflection on pride, fame, knowledge, and the fragile nature of human hope. It begins with a phrase that still causes a sting, more popular than Jesus. That line, spoken by a young Beatles member in the mid-1960s, ignited a firestorm. John Lennon, at the height of Beatlemania, reportedly said he thought that rock music was replacing Christianity in the lives of young people. The context matters. He was speaking about cultural shifts, not delivering a theological treatise. Yet when excerpts ran in the press, churches burned records, radio stations banned the band, and people felt betrayed. The immediate reaction was moral outrage. Politicians and pastors denounced the remark, and the Beatles found themselves in the crosshairs of a culture that had both made them icons and expected them to carry the sacred as well as the secular. Lennon's life afterward included creative peaks, personal struggles, and ultimately a violent public death. He was murdered outside his home in 1980. What does his story teach us? There is a warning here about celebrity and the temptation to equate popularity with truth. A remark blown into scandal showed how a culture can turn its idols into targets, and how an uncompromising posture, whether by pride or by frustration, can harden public hearts. The pastoral lesson is simple. Words have weight. Humanity's applause does not replace reverence. We must be careful when we speak about things holy and humble when we step into public influence. A second figure from the silver screen lived a life of glamour and rumor, Marilyn Monroe. On stage, she was luminous. Off stage, she was a woman whose private doubts and struggles played out in tabloids. It has been reported in various biographies and interviews that she made skeptical or dismissive comments about organized religion, and that she struggled to find spiritual anchoring. The reaction to her image and her statements was less a theological crusade than an intense fascination. Fans wanted to know what the star believed. Critics wanted to dissect her. Her life ended tragically in 1962 with a death that was ruled an overdose, and since then her biography has been interpreted through countless lenses. When we reflect pastorally, we do not claim divine causation for what happened to her. Instead, we see an emblem of what fame and desire for approval can do to the soul. The lights, the applause, and the myth that surrounds a person can hide a profound loneliness. The spiritual implication is that the absence of a trusted community and of humility before the mystery of life can leave a person vulnerable. The gospel speaks to that emptiness, offering a place where longing is met, not merely admired. Not all offenses are simple one-liners. Some are artistic revolts, declarations of a countercultural creed. Consider Raul Seixas, the Brazilian rock artist, who, influenced by transgressive ideas and, by his own admission, by the writings of occult figures, released songs and manifestos that challenged formless authority, including religious institutions. His Sociedade Alternativa, inspired in part by ideas associated with Aleister Crowley, sounded like a call to autonomy. In a society where Christian faith shaped public moral discourse, his work provoked strong criticism, but it also gathered a devoted following. The immediate aftermath was a mixture of scandal and fascination, radio bans at times, heated debates, and eventually a life that unraveled under the strain of substance abuse and health decline. Raul died in 1989, his body ravaged by habits that had been part of the mythology around him. The pastoral reading here is not punitive. Rather, it asks what happens when rebellion becomes identity and spiritual voids are filled with idols of self-glory. The Christian caution is against letting the desire for notoriety or the thrill of defiance replace the quieter work of repentance and reconnection with what is good. Aleister Crowley is a name that evokes images of ritual, of the occult flaunted as philosophy. He openly challenged Christian morality and took pride in being cast as the wickedest man in the world. Crowley wrote, performed, and lived as a provocateur, invited scorn, courted scandal, and intentionally set himself against church religion. The reaction from established religion was predictably hostile. Books condemned, bishops warned their flocks, while parts of the cultural avant-garde were magnetized by his audacity. Crowley's later years were marked by addiction and physical decline. He died in 1947 from complications related to illness and long-term substance use. Theologically, his life raises the question of what it means to build an identity on being an enemy of God. Again, we are not stating that death was retributive. We are observing the pattern that a life oriented toward rebellion often impoverishes the inner life. The gospel offers a different courage, the courage to admit error and change course, the courage to exchange notoriety for truth. There are examples where the alleged offense was not a philosophical oath against Christ, but a dramatic act of protest. In 1992, a well-known Irish singer took to an American television stage and tore up a photograph of the Pope. She later explained the act as protest over abuses the church had ignored and as a symbol of resistance to institutional harm. The immediate reaction was devastatingly swift. Radio silence, cancellation of appearances, fierce public condemnation, and a sense that the act had crossed a line. In the years that followed, the artist's life was complicated by mental health struggles, public ostracism, and tragic loss. She died in 2023, leaving behind a legacy of both prophetic courage and personal pain. Pastoral reflection here must be doubly careful. Prophetic protest at times speaks truth to power, and the Christian witness includes those who call institutions to account. Yet when protest is met with cruelty, the human cost can be high. Our response must avoid triumphalism. We should grieve the breakdown, pray for restoration where possible, and learn how to show compassion to those who speak hard truths yet suffer afterwards. The world of rock and roll provides multiple examples of defiant swagger that clashed with Christian sensibilities. Bon Scott, the voice of AC/DC in their formative years, embodied a wild, unapologetic lifestyle that often cheekily flouted conservative religious values. Songs and stage persona glorified excess, and the public response at times was moral condemnation as well as rock adulation. Scott's life ended suddenly in 1980 under circumstances linked to acute alcohol intoxication and asphyxia after a night of heavy drinking. When we reflect pastorally, we must not use his death to gloat. Instead, we see how a culture that elevates reckless abandon can destroy the body and the relationships that sustain a person. There is a spiritual cost to living as if one's appetites are sovereign. The Church's message is an invitation to temperance, accountability, and the healing of broken patterns. When scientific ideas become a challenge to theology, the backlash can be intense, and the figure at the center of debate can be cast as an intellectual adversary. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was understood by many in the 19th century as a direct challenge to traditional readings of Genesis and to claims about divine design. Darwin himself was complex in his beliefs. At times private and at times publicly cautious, he never made a clear, defiant slogan against Jesus in the way a polemicist might. The public reaction, however, was fierce debate, polarizing lectures, and cultural anxiety about the implications of naturalistic explanations for human origin. Darwin died in 1882 after years of ill health. The pastoral question arising from his life and the controversy around it is how we hold scientific conviction and spiritual humility together. God is not threatened by inquiry. A faithful posture is one that pursues truth while maintaining reverence for mystery and for the spiritual goods that science alone cannot satisfy. Brilliance and public avowal of unbelief can also become a cultural lightning rod. Stephen Hawking, who spent decades exploring the cosmos and famously said in interviews that he did not believe in a personal God, became a symbol for a scientific worldview that declared no need for divine intervention in the mechanics of the universe. His remarks, clearer and more theological in some interviews than in others, provoked gratitude from the secular world and grief or concern from religious readers. Hawking's body lived on a long fight with a devastating illness. He died in 2018 of complications related to his disease. The pastoral reflection is not to attack the man's intellect, but to remind us that human genius does not answer every question of meaning. Science maps the how. Spiritual wisdom helps us see the why. The Christian invitation is not to deny reason, but to place it within a larger story, where the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Not all who end violently were famous for intellectual rebellion. Some simply lived in full opposition to the moral order most Christians uphold. Pablo Escobar, the Colombian cartel leader, was notorious for brutality, vast wealth obtained by organized crime, and a life built on terror and corruption. While Escobar's relationship to formal religion is mixed in sources, he was baptized Catholic but lived a life that flagrantly violated the gospel. His public persona was one of domination rather than of faith. Society's reaction was unsurprising: violent crackdowns, police operations, and international condemnation. He died in 1993, shot during a police operation. The pastoral reflection here is not to equate criminal punishment with divine judgment. The state responded to criminality with force. Yet morally, his life is a striking example of what the Bible warns. When power and wealth become idols, they destroy those who make them gods. Christianity calls for repentance and for a turning away from violence and greed, but it also calls the church to compassion for victims and to recovery for the broken. There are cases where the offense is not a statement about God, but a posture of confidence in human design and human invulnerability. The story of the Titanic and of those who designed it has been handed down as a parable of human hubris. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, is often remembered for his tireless efforts on that night, reportedly staying aboard to help passengers, and for his tragic death when the ship went down in 1912. There is no historical claim that Andrews publicly denounced Jesus. Rather, his inclusion in lists like this is an emblematic use of his life. A man who placed trust in human craftsmanship and who perished in a disaster that humbled an age enamored with progress. The public reaction after the sinking was shock, legal inquiry, and a moral reckoning about safety, negligence, and presumption. Spiritually, the lesson is about humility before creation. The technological advances that improve our lives are gifts, not guarantees. The Christian posture is to thank God for human ingenuity while maintaining reverence for the fragility of life. Political life sometimes leads to charges of secularism or indifference to faith. Tancredo Neves, the Brazilian political figure who was elected to lead his country but died before taking office, is a complicated case. He was not widely known for proclaiming hostility to Christianity. Rather, he was a public servant who operated in a plural society. Some narratives have framed him as emblematic of a new, less overtly clerical political class, while others insist his faith was private and nuanced. His final days, hospitalization and death in 1985, left a nation stunned. Including him in a list of offenders requires caution. Sources do not uniformly report a specific anti-Christian statement, so we must label this as indefinido regarding any claim that he publicly rejected Jesus. The pastoral angle is broader. Political leadership that forgets spiritual accountability risks becoming merely transactional. Leaders and citizens alike need moral anchors that transcend expediency. One name in the record before us is uncertain, marked as indefinido, because primary sources are unclear or contested. There are cases where rumors or single-source reports name a person as having said something blasphemous, but the evidence is thin. For this category, we should do two things: state the allegation as such, reported or attributed to, and use the situation as a caution against gossip. The desire to find poetic justice in the misfortune of another tempts us, but Christian charity demands restraint. Our pastoral posture must be careful, not quick to declare guilt or to enjoy the fall of another. When a source is contested, humility and further investigation are called for. When public offences are compounded by personal self-destruction, the result is heartbreak rather than vindication. Consider those whose careers leaned on antagonism and bravado, performing artists, public intellectuals, activists. Some end by losing the community that once cheered them. The pattern is familiar. After the initial outrage or applause, many find themselves isolated. Applause does not equal friendship. Notoriety does not equal intimacy. For each of the lives we have sketched so far, there is a line we cannot cross in our reflections. We are not God's prosecutors. We cannot say the end was divine punishment. We can, however, notice patterns. Pride estranges. Relentless autonomy corrodes relationships. Public defiance can isolate a person, sometimes by their own choices, sometimes by the reactions of others. Between these stories, a recurrent motif appears. A life seduced by the illusion of control ends with vulnerability. The singer who tore at an image to make a point was later left without the industry support she once had. The rock star who joked and lived loudly was later found lifeless after a night of excess. The theorist whose books changed how the world thinks about origins died quietly after long illness. The pattern is not deterministic, and we insist on that. There are countless people who sincerely reject faith and die at peace, and countless believers who die tragically. What the pattern invites us to see is moral and spiritual, words and acts that elevate the self, or that treat God as a rhetorical target, often signal a posture that makes reconciliation harder later on. The Bible speaks about the wisdom of fear of the Lord as a beginning, that fear not of terror, but of reverence, of rightly ordered awe that places our understanding within a greater reality. At the center of our reflection is a verse we return to, not as a gavel, but as a guide. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This proverb does not claim that every who lacks reverence will suffer swift calamity, nor does it promise that every who reveres God will have easy days. It is, however, a theological axis. Wisdom begins when we stop placing ourselves at the center of meaning. The lives we have considered illustrate different kinds of centricity: self, fame, ideology, pleasure, and how each can fail to satisfy. In pastoral terms, we are invited to a robust humility, to a faith that withstands the seduction of applause and the arrogance of absolute certitude. So what do we do with these stories? First, we refuse schadenfreude. The Christian response to the fall of the proud is not to celebrate, but to mourn, and to offer the mercy we wish we had been offered. Second, we heed the moral warnings, examine the ways we might be enthralled by our status, by an idea, or by the applause of others. Third, we pursue reconciliation where it is possible, repair of relationships, public acts of contrition, the quiet work of repentance. For those of us in positions of influence, the stories are a compelling reason to cultivate humility now, to check our speech about holy things, to protect our vulnerability with community, and to remember that our best arguments carry more weight when they come from lives of integrity. A practical application. If you are tempted to use provocative language to win attention, ask what you are trading for it. If you are a listener who has been wounded by institutions of faith, do not let the failures of others push you into cynicism. Seek a faithful community and a God who hears lament. If you are in public life, surround yourself with people who will say hard things to you in love. The church's mission is not to cast stones, but to point people toward restoration. These 12 narratives are not forensic proof that blasphemy brings immediate ruin. They are cautionary tales that highlight how pride, isolation, and the elevation of the self can produce tragic consequences. We close with the pastoral insistence that mercy remains open. The proverb we have used is not a verdict, but a doorway. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Let that reverence reframe our ambitions, our cultural critiques, and our private thoughts. Let it teach us to speak with humility, to protest with compassion, and to live with an eye toward reconciliation rather than spectacle. If these reflections have touched you, if you want more sober conversations where culture and faith meet, subscribe and stay with us as we continue to read our world with a humble heart. Finally, carry this to your living rooms and conversations. Remember the fragile dignity of every person. Refuse to gloat at another's fall, and let reverence, fear of the Lord, be the root of your wisdom. If this message moved you, share it with someone who needs a sober reminder and subscribe for more.